Welcome to Christian Virtual Fellowship. Tonight we have um, a new teacher who's going to be sharing with us from the Word. His name is Greg Mappleback. Greg and his wife Angela have been attending Christian Virtual Fellowship for a while now, and I actually got to meet them in at the UCA conference, which was really great. They're just really wonderful people, and they came all the way down from Western Canada. And so I'm really looking forward to this. Greg and I had a chance to talk about what he's going to share on tonight. And it seemed really cool, really interesting. But if you're new to Christian Virtual Fellowship and Allegiance to the King, we invite you to check out our webpage at a2kchurch.org, the number 2kchurch.org, or at allegiancetotheking.org, and check it out there. And if you like what you see, get in contact with us. Come join us for Wednesday night or Sunday morning. Christian Virtual Fellowship is intended to be an online church for isolated biblical Unitarians. So if that's you, if you have either been a Unitarian for a long time or you've more recently become a Unitarian, and especially if you found that wasn't going to fly in your church and you've had to leave your church and you don't know what you're going to do, come join us, be a part of our church. Okay, Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right. Okay. You guys can see my screen and everything? Okay.
Yep.
So are we going to talk about something lurking in the back of your fridge? Leftovers aren't always bad. Sometimes they're very good, even better than the first time the meal was served. But sometimes, something's not working here. What was that? Is that a moon of Jupiter? Pancakes. No, it's healthy, vibrant leaven. It's what is left over from a previous baking of sourdough. It is what the Bible is talking about when it uses the word leaven. And what inspired me to talk to you about leaven? Well, about 10 years ago or more, we learned how to make sourdough bread. And when I say we, I mean my wife, Angela. I was just tagging along for the ride. Angela has become a master sourdough baker. This is one of her amazing, delicious loaves. How do you become a sourdough master? You must begin with the trial of making a sourdough starter, grasshopper. To make sourdough starter, you only need 2 ingredients, flour and water. It is best to start with some fresh ground wheat grains because you'll also need millions of assistants for this process. The wheat grains are covered in natural yeasts and bacteria of various kinds, some good, some bad. This process will take a minimum of 1 week, but probably more like 10 days. So on day 1, you mix together flour and water and cover it loosely. And you might put like a little marker on your jar to mark the level of this paste that you've mixed up. And if you want to cheat a little bit, you can add some liquid that might separate out of your yogurt, like some whey, or a bit of juice from a sauerkraut ferment, because this stuff is teeming with lactobacillus bacteria, and that's what you really want to be thriving in your sourdough starter. But just remember, that's cheating. So day 2, it's going to look pretty much the same as day 1, but what you would do on day 2 is you would take half of this and put it into a clean jar and then feed it with some fresh flour and water. And you might see a few bubbles forming at this time, but probably not too much. So for days 3, 4, 5, and 6, if things are going good, you will see bubbles starting to form more and more each day. And each day you do the same thing. You would remove what has expanded and grown. You'd take it down to a level that's about halfway as much as you started with, and then add fresh flour and water. And it's not just yeast that's growing in here. Lactobacillus bacteria of various kinds are breaking down starches and making sugars available for the yeast. It's a symbiotic relationship. You need the yeast and the bacteria together. Lactobacillus bacteria also create an acidic environment that is inhospitable to harmful microbes. So you should start to notice sour odor and taste as the days progress. And then day 7, if everything has gone perfectly, you should be ready to make your first sourdough loaf. If not, contact Angela. I've shown you a perfect scenario, but certainly things can go wrong and the process can be delayed. Some people have a difficult time with this, and when they finally succeed, they really treasure their starters and the bread that comes from them. So now it's time to make your first loaf of bread. But one very important thing, don't use all your starter. Leave some behind. This leftover becomes your leaven. Technically, the starter is what you create to make your first loaf. It's not leaven until it's left over from your baking. So leaven is something you leave behind. You see how the word leave is even built into the word leaven, how they're related in English. And now we're going to go and see how they're actually related in Hebrew as well. So why talk about leaven in a Bible study? Well, the Hebrew scriptures talk about leaven. Yahweh commanded the Israelites to eliminate leaven at certain times. Jesus warns us to avoid a certain type of leaven. And Jesus used leaven in a parable, and Paul spoke about leaven. Most of us who have grown up in modern Western culture will not be thinking about leaven in the same way that ancient people in the Bible did. My goal is to help you understand leaven in the way the Israelites fleeing from Egypt understood leaven, the way Jesus' disciples thought about leaven. So a biblical understanding of leaven will help us to understand Jesus' warning about the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. It'll help us to understand why Yahweh commanded the Israelites to remove leaven from their presence at appointed times, but we'll cover that in part 2 of this study. And it'll help us to understand how we can deal with the effects of metaphorical leaven in our Christian lives and studies. Also, we'll cover that in part 2. So the Hebrew scriptures talk about leaven. Now, this number here is a Strong's number, and it comes from Strong's Concordance that he wrote in 1890, but a lot of lexicons use these numbers to organize Hebrew and Greek words as well. The definitions I'm using in this are coming from Brown Driver Briggs lexicon. Now, this word for leaven in Hebrew starts with the three, it has the 3 consonants, Sin, Aleph, and Resh. And it occurs 5 times, 3 times in Exodus, once in Leviticus, and once in Deuteronomy. And it's pronounced Seor, something like that. Anyway, that's Hebrew with an English accent. And the definition is leaven. Well, let's look at the Oxford definition of leaven. It says, 1, a substance, typically yeast, that is used in dough to make it rise. And 2, a pervasive influence that modifies something or transforms it for the better. So most people would agree that risen bread is better, more pleasant to eat than unrisen bread. Thus, we can understand definition 2 that says leaven can metaphorically be used to talk of an influence that modifies or transforms something for the better. The Bible also uses a metaphor that leaven can transform something for the worse as well. But there's a problem with definition 1. It's anachronistic. It's using modern terms to describe an ancient thing. At least in the study that we're doing, we're trying to understand leaven as the Hebrews understood it, or how the first century Christians understood it. So we need to keep in mind, okay, so today it's typical to go to the store, pick up a packet of refined yeast and use that to make bread rise. But less than 300 years ago, commercial bakers would set up shop beside a brewery and use barm, which is the froth left over from beer making, or use leftover sourdough to make bread. It wasn't until 1780 that the Dutch could purchase yeast from a store, and Americans would have to wait for Mr. Fleischmann to make it available in 1876. So your typical Hebrew would not be able to go to the store and buy a packet of yeast to make leaven. See, so they would use leftover sourdough from a previous bake to transform their bread dough. What I want to show you is that the Hebrew word for leaven means something left over. Just like there's leave in the English word leaven, in the Hebrew form of that word, there is a connection to something left over. And this is the way the Hebrews fleeing from Egypt understood it, and also the way Jesus' disciples understood it. So if we want to understand the metaphors in the Bible for leaven, then we must first understand the true meaning. So again, we have this consonant sin, aleph, and resh. Kind of went over this already. The pronunciation, seor. And now, when we have a word that only occurs 5 times, sometimes we can look at other words that are related to it to get more nuance on the meaning. And so we'll notice here that it says that it comes from H7604. And if we examine that, there's 7604. It occurs 133 times. And the definition of that is to remain, be left over, or left behind. Here's our original word that, for leaven. We see it's the same 3 consonants, and we have these other 2 words as well. And so all 4 of these words total up to 176 usages. The consonants are the same, but you'll notice, I don't know if you can see these little dots and dashes, but those you probably know are the vowel pointings that were invented by the Masoretes. And they invented that because Hebrew had really gone out of use, and it was those marks are put there for people who are not that familiar with speaking Hebrew every day to know how to pronounce those words based on the context in which they sit. So based on the context, the meaning can be changed slightly and the pronunciation can be changed slightly, but it still kind of has the same underlying meaning. And you might notice that these 2 words have the same vowel pointings. So you might be wondering, well, why is it considered a different word? And that's because the last one there is actually in Aramaic, and it appears in the Aramaic parts of Daniel and in the book of Ezra. So even though the vowel sounds are the same and in the same place, some of the consonants are pronounced different in Aramaic, and it is still a slightly different word. Okay, so we have 176 uses. It's definitely, you can see how Leaven is, how we can get a better idea of the meaning by these other words that are spelled with the same consonants. It's definitely related to something left over. This is kind of a repeat here. So not only is it something left over, but I would like to be able to show you that it means that it's something that has the potential to expand and grow. And we saw that in the Oxford definition as well, speaking more in a metaphorical sense. Well, in the literal sense too, that it helps bread to expand and grow. And then I think there's a meaning there that shows that this is something that's dear to its owner and maker. And I kind of discussed that when we were talking about making a sourdough starter. And when you finally succeed and you've made like 20 or 30 loaves and they've turned out beautiful and wonderful, that's not something you want to get rid of. You can imagine being like a Jewish person or a person that's following the Torah, and they're supposed to throw that out during the festival of unleavened bread. That's not going to be an easy thing to do for them if they're really into sourdough baking. So let's look at a couple examples. Here we have the example of the ark. Noah and the animals are all on the ark, and it's talking about the time of the flood. It says, "Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to the birds of the sky. They were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left, together with those that were with him on the ark." So were those on the ark left over or a remnant of the rest of the people on earth? Yes. Did this remnant have the potential to grow or expand? Yes. Genesis 8:17 says, "Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So they certainly did have this potential to grow. And of course, we know this remnant was something that was dear to its owner maker. In this sense, God, he really wanted to protect the animals and Noah and his family from this disaster. Another example in Genesis 42:38, this is when Joseph's brothers have returned from Egypt. They've just met up with Joseph. They've gotten grain because there was famine in the land of Israel. And they didn't recognize Joseph. But Joseph told them, "Whatever you do, don't come back here again unless you bring your brother Benjamin." And so at this point, they're trying to talk Jacob into letting them take Benjamin with them so they can go back and get grain. And Jacob says, "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, then you will bring down my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow." So in Jacob's mind, Benjamin was the only one left over, or a remnant from his wife Rachel. And this remnant had a potential to grow and expand. In fact, Benjamin, when they entered Israel, as the whole family entered Israel, he had 10 sons already. So he was already well on his way. And this remnant was definitely something dear to its owner maker, because Jacob said, if something should happen to Benjamin, it's going to kill me. So we'll look at one last example. In this account, Isaiah chapter 37, verses 31 and 32, it's talking about when the Assyrian army had Jerusalem under siege in Hezekiah's 14th year. And Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, had already defeated many fortified cities of Judah and killed many people. But Yahweh was promising through Isaiah that the remnant inside of Jerusalem would not be destroyed. So it says, the surviving remnant of the house of Judah will again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem will go forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion survivors. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. And we can notice one thing here is I didn't really discuss this word here. It says 7611. That wasn't included in those 176 examples of other words. This one has the same 3 Hebrew consonants at the beginning, but then it ends with a yud and a sab. And so there's 5 consonants in that word. But yet still you can see how it carries the same meaning. It's defined the same way. And again, we see the same 3 things being met really here. They are a remnant, a leftover inside of Jerusalem. They do have the potential to grow. Notice that God is saying they're going to bear fruit upwards. That's his plan for them. And they are, of course, dear to God. So we see something similar to this in English as well. For example, we have words like read and read. Depending on the context, we spell them the same way, but pronounce it differently, and it has a slightly different meaning. Or we might spell it the same way and pronounce it the same way, and yet the meaning will be different. So the moose is on the road. There were many moose on the road. We can obviously see the difference between singular and plural. This is a Canadian problem. And another example is we can have words that begin similarly. These all begin with the same 3 consonants. And, although their meanings are different, there's a general underlying meaning that's kind of similar. They're all related to something smooth and shiny. So hopefully I've established that the proper understanding of leaven is literally something that's left over from sourdough baking. Now, the Hebrew scriptures commanded the Israelites to eliminate leaven at certain times. Exodus 12:15 says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. This scripture is very similar, except it ends slightly different. It just says, this includes alien residents who are dwelling with you as well. And then again, we see in Deuteronomy, Moses, after they had been in the wilderness for 40 years, is reiterating this law to them. I'm just kind of skimming over this part because I don't really have time to go over that. We'll be going over this and discussing it more in part 2. Now, Jesus warned us to avoid a certain type of leaven. Matthew 16, verse 6 says, and Jesus said to them, watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Mark 8:15 is basically the same account, Mark's version, and he was giving orders to them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And then there's another warning in Luke. He began saying to his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Is there something inherently wrong with leaven? Let's look at an example of leaven being put in a good light. Jesus used leaven in a parable. Here, Jesus is presenting leaven in a good light and bringing out the idea that a small amount of leaven can grow to have a large effect in the end. It says Matthew 13:33, he spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened. And the account in Luke is basically the same, except instead of saying the kingdom of heaven, we see it says the kingdom of God. So that's just another way of expressing the same thing. Other than that, they're saying the same thing. And Paul also has a couple examples of leaven, but here we go back to something that's talking about leaven in a negative way. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul discusses a situation where the congregation was ignoring gross immorality. A man having relations with his father's wife. Paul instructs them to promptly remove this man from their midst before the immorality spreads through the entire congregation. In this case, he was comparing this man's immoral influence to leaven and the congregation to unleavened dough. And Paul's other example in Galatians chapter 5, he's warning the Galatians that if they give in to those trying to persuade them to be circumcised, they will soon be persuaded to keep the entire Mosaic law. He says this persuasion is not coming from him who calls you, but compares it to leaven. In these two accounts, we see Paul is warning that a bad influence, leaven, affecting a small part of these congregations, lumps of dough, can quickly spread through the entire congregation. So just to review, we established that leaven is related to leftovers, a remnant. Leaven is something that can have a transforming influence on dough and cause it to grow. It is something beneficial for its owner maker and not something they want to part with. Despite its benefits, God commanded the Israelites to dispose of their prized leaven at an appointed time once every year. Now, the New Testament implies through the teachings of Jesus and Paul that there is a greater spiritual meaning to leaven. And metaphorically, leaven is an influence that can start off small and have a large spreading effect for either good or bad. So now we're going to talk about the disciples finally understanding what Jesus meant by leaven, or the leaven of the Pharisees. Now, as we are going to read this account, Jesus has recently fed 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fish. We see this account in the books of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then, shortly afterwards, he feeds 4,000 with 7 loaves and a few fish. And we see that accounted, spoken of in Matthew and Mark. Note the ending here of the feeding of the 5,000 in the 4th gospel, how the people responded. It says, therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Oh, after feeding the 5,000 and shortly after feeding the 4,000, Jesus and his disciples must have been on a real spiritual high. Jesus is about to bring them down from that high for the purpose of teaching them something profound. So this is the backstory to Jesus' warning about the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So after feeding the 4,000, Jesus takes his disciples on a teaching expedition. He instructs them to sail to another spot on the Sea of Galilee where they will meet up with the Pharisees and Sadducees. As soon as this meeting is over, they hop back in the boat and sail away. So it just seems like he specifically takes them here for a certain purpose. Now, this account comes immediately after the feeding of the 4,000 in both Matthew and Mark. And we could give these teachers the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps they had not yet heard of the feeding of the 4,000. But obviously, they must have been aware of the previous feeding of the 5,000. Some of them were probably present at that event. So let's read this account. It says, the Pharisees and Sadducees came up and testing Jesus, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. But he replied to them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. Do you know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the times? An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and a sign will not be given it, except the sign of Jonah. And he left them and went away. So this was a real eye-rolling moment for Jesus and his disciples. I mean, they had just fed 9,000 people with 12 loaves of bread, and the Pharisees and Sadducees are asking for a sign? Are they blind? Jesus has his disciples get back in the boat and go to the other side of the lake. So as they're traveling on the boat, no doubt Jesus and his disciples are reflecting on what just happened. Peter is about to correctly identify Jesus as God's Messiah and the coming King of God's kingdom. Perhaps they had eager expectations that the teachers of Israel would finally see Jesus for who he truly was. Yet those Pharisees and Sadducees, those respected teachers amongst the crowds, are blind to the great signs that Jesus is doing. Imagine the feelings that are left over in their hearts and minds after this encounter. On top of that, on top of these bad feelings, they just realized they forgot to bring bread. So let's read the account. And the disciples came to the other side of the sea. They had forgotten to bring bread. And Jesus said to them, watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They began to discuss this among themselves. He said that because we didn't bring any bread. But Jesus, aware of this, said, you man of little faith, why do you discuss among yourselves that you have no bread? Do you not understand or remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000 and how many baskets full you picked up? Or the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets full you picked up? How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread? But beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not say, beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Notice Jesus is trying to get them to focus on what was left over from his spiritual and physical feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000. Because he's trying to contrast this with what is left over in their minds from their experience with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In Mark's recording of the same account, Jesus asks these questions. Why do you discuss that you have no bread? And he says, do you not see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, are you blind? Having ears, are you deaf? You see, like the Pharisees and Sadducees. So this is what was left over, or leaven, in the hearts and minds of the disciples after their interaction with teachers who don't understand the power of God, have hardened hearts, and are spiritually blind and deaf. Just like the scripture says there in Luke 6:39 to 40. A blind man cannot guide a blind man, can he? Will they not both fall into a pit? A pupil is not above his master, but everyone, after he has been fully trained, will be like his teacher. So Jesus is trying to point out that they regard these men as teachers, these men who don't understand the power of God and have hardened hearts and are spiritually blind and deaf. And what's happening to them? You see, Jesus is asking them these questions. Do you not understand? Do you have a hardened heart? So he's contrasting. We can contrast what was left over from Jesus' teaching and feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000. When Jesus taught the multitudes, their hearts and minds were filled with the words of God, bread from heaven. Their stomachs were filled with actual bread. They understood the source of the teachings, and literal bread was from God. And their hearts were softened. Their eyes were opened. They saw the sign which he had performed. They said, this truly is the prophet who is to come into the world. Their ears were open. They heard the words of God. They had full minds to go home with and share what they learned with others. They had full stomachs for their journey home and even leftovers for their journey to come. Spiritual leftovers for their spiritual journey, physical leftovers for their physical journey. So here we can really see the difference between a good teacher and, wicked teachers. Jesus' leaven is a good leaven. The influence, he leaves behind an influence that transforms and grows into something good. His teachings were good and beneficial. They had the potential to grow and expand into something greater and better. Just before he died, he told his disciples, truly, truly, I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also, and greater works than these he will do, because I go to the Father. So you see, by learning from a good teacher, we have the potential for things to grow bigger and better in a good way. Now, the Pharisees, on the other hand, their influence inspired the growth of spiritual blindness and deafness. The leftovers, or leaven, from the Pharisees and Sadducees were bad and detrimental. They had the potential to grow and expand into something much worse. And you can see how they were having an effect on the hearts of Jesus' disciples. And this is why he warned them when he warned them, because he knew how they were feeling and how they were, feeling down and worried that, oh, is Jesus going to judge us judgmentally like these other leaders judge us judgmentally? They were afraid to tell him they forgot bread. They still had a loaf of bread. Jesus could have made more bread for them. Yeah, except, they were being affected by these other teachers. So, in conclusion for tonight, leaven is something literally left over after the baking of bread. Figuratively, leaven can refer to an influence that is left behind after listening to one regarded as a teacher. This influence can be good and cause good growth, but a bad influence can cause growth in a detrimental way. Leaven is not something easily parted with. Yahweh, Jesus, and Paul all commanded us to rid ourselves of leaven at certain times. So we'll explore more about this in part 2. That's all I have to say about that.
All right, let me do a couple of quick things here, Greg. Oh, well, I don't see my button to.
Should I pause this share?
There we go. I found it. All right, and we'll take any questions or comments if you want to raise your hand.
Well, that was good enough to convince me that I need to read the gospel record again.
Well, it was a little bit of a different take. Okay, Ray, you got something to say.
Very blessed with your teaching. Because I'm preparing my own teaching, and yours and mine complement each other so well that and you'll see it next week.
Okay, great. I'm looking
A week
forward
from
to
today,
that.
it'll be my turn. But very blessed with your teaching about the heart, about believing, about unbelief, about the Pharisees and they're demanding a sign. I thought your comment was excellent. Here he feeds 9,000 people and they're asking him for a sign.
Right.
I mean, that was a very appropriate comment on your part. In any case, I could see how the disciples were kind of on a roller coaster of believing and unbelieving, believing and unbelieving. And anyway, thank you very much, and I look forward to part 2.
Okay. You're welcome. It's a little bit of a different take because I didn't really comment on, a lot of people say, oh, well, leaven represents sin and corruption. And if you look it up on Google, that's kind of what you're going to see. And if you look in the commentaries, that's what you're going to see. But, sometimes you learn lessons through personal experience. And just the fact that we were going through this process of learning how to make sourdough and finding out about how leaven works and whatnot. And then I started looking into it in the Bible, and I'm like, really does mean that it's left over. And there's other examples where it's used in a good light. So it can't just mean sin or corruption all the time. There's got to be something else to it. So
That's pretty observant of you to catch that.
So it can be a good influence or a bad influence, Greg.
What's a bad influence?
It can be leaven can be a good influence or a bad influence. It just has significant influences, the way I'm understanding the message.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, because it's like something that's left behind.
Mm,
It's got that deeper meaning to it. And so if you listen to the teachings of Jesus, well then he's going to leave behind good leaven. He's going to leave behind something that can be in your heart and grow into something bigger that you can share with other people and feed other people with. And and so it's not always bad. But then if what's left behind in your heart is from a teacher who doesn't trust God or doesn't believe in miracles or has a hard heart or something, then
yeah.
you're going to start imitating what they do and think.
So it could include us bringing our preconceived ideas and understandings
Oh,
to
yeah, that's
as
what I
well.
kind of want to get into in part two, because
Yeah.
that's really where I wanted to go. And I probably spent too much time trying to establish that leaven means something left over, but I guess I wanted to be thorough on that because
Mm,
it is a different idea. I mean, I look in places and nobody else seems to be talking about that. So that's kind of why I wanted to spend a lot of time on that, and then maybe we can go talk about some of these other things
yeah, well,
later
it's
on.
expanded my understanding of the meaning of leaven. A lot of us do take it in a bad context and no more than that. So yeah, thank you for that.
Steve and Phyllis have got their hand up.
Oh, I didn't. Oh, Stephen Phyllis, yeah.
Thanks, Greg. I really like your take on it. And like Peter was saying, it's been a time when I've heard leaven always referred to as something negative, and or that they equate it to something negative. But Jesus and Paul, as you said, they pointed out that there's certain types of leaven that you need to be wary of. And Jesus is the one that equated how the kingdom of God was like leaven, in this world, and how it can be an influence. Start out so small, but it ends up what a little leaven can affect the whole lump. And
Yeah,
this is
in a
how
good
the
way.
kingdom, yeah, in a great way. And I even like how you approached it in terms of, sometimes leaven, when you were showing about how it was with the Israelites and how they had to certain times had to get it, not just they couldn't eat it, had to get it completely out the house. And but the way you introduce the importance of it and how hard you work to get that starter dough and everything, and then to think, well, you got to get that out the house. Sometimes it's not easy to part with it, and that really caught my attention. And the other night we were looking at a scripture about throwing your pearls before swine. And I mean, that's kind of a strong statement, but when the example was given about how, I mean, he fed 4,000, he fed 5,000, and then the Pharisees are asking, give us a sign. And what are you gonna say? So they just left. And I see why, because you be wasting your breath, throwing your pearls out before someone that it's not that they didn't want to get it. They would have been just wasting their breath. So it's so much in this. And it just shows you how, like Jimbo was saying, we got to go back and read some things that we just read over. Is so many jewels in that. And for each one of us, we'll come in at it at a different way. I love your perspective. And thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Thanks for your comment. That's really encouraging.
Well, why don't we go ahead and close out the video and the recording. If you're watching this and you've got questions, we want to hear them. Put some questions in the YouTube video on the YouTube channel for Greg if you want there, or you can get in contact with us through the website or on the Christian Virtual Fellowship page on Facebook. And we also have an Allegiance to the King group on Facebook as well, if you'd like to join that. And but definitely, if you're watching this and you've got questions, let us know and we'll get back to you. And with that, we will see you next time.